Well, good evening. I want to welcome you to this event live again here on Facebook as part of our Be the Change series. And so we have the luxury of having some great folks with us for this conversation tonight as we talk about race and criminal justice. As many of you know, we have been having these conversations now for really the last week. We had our first conversation last week about addressing racism. And tonight we're talking again about race and criminal justice. And so we wanted to host these forums in order to be able to kind of engage in a conversation that will benefit our community, to bring unity, but also talk about some tough subjects that are necessary. This is the second in our series, and we'll go on and host, Lord willing, 2 more. And so the event is sponsored by United Way of West Tennessee. I have the pleasure and privilege of serving there as the president and CEO, but it's also sponsored by the Jackson Chamber and our Jackson Home. And so tonight we have with us for our panelists, Dr. Cindy Boyles. Dr. Boyles is a professor at UT Martin, specifically in the area of criminal justice, what we'll be discussing tonight. She's in her 7th year teaching there at UT Martin. And so Cindy, we're glad to have you tonight. We also have with us new Deputy Chief Derick Tisdale. He's not new to Jackson, he's not new to the JPD, but he is now a Deputy Chief, so congratulations. He has been with the JPD for 25 years. It'll be 26 years in October that he's been serving our community. And so we're thankful to have you on tonight as well.
Thank you.
And then last, but certainly not least, is Attorney Kortney Simmons. Attorney Simmons is originally from our sister city, Memphis, down the road, but she has called Jackson home for the past 9 years. And she is one of the partners at KC Simmons and Bryant PLLC, founding partner of that law firm. And so that's been here in existence since 2015. And so Attorney Simmons, we're glad to have you as well. Well, we're going to go ahead and jump in for tonight into our questions. This first question is for all of you, so feel free to chime in. Cindy, let's start with you. When we look at the data, particularly as it relates to the issue we're talking about tonight, criminal justice, the Prison Policy Initiative has said that approximately 58,000 people in the state of Tennessee or from Tennessee are behind bars. Our state has an incarceration rate of 853 per 100,000 people. Now, of course, that includes folks that are in prisons, that are in jails, that are in immigration detention, that are in juvenile justice facilities. And why I bring that statistic up is because what that means is that we lock up, honestly, according to the data, a higher percentage of people in our state than most wealthy democracies around the world do. The first question we want to ask is, why does Tennessee have such a high incarceration rate? What would you say to that?
Well, I think there's a number of different reasons for that. And I think the first reason and the biggest reason is because we allow it to. We probably, in reality, in Tennessee, we've probably actually insisted on it through the people that we represent to get the legislature and pass the laws for us. So when we think about the people in jail and prison, many of us think about violent offenders and we think, well, they're there for a reason and they deserve to be locked up. So what we're seeing are the effects of our law and order demands that have resulted in these increasing number of crimes and then the sentences that go along with those crimes. And our prison and jail population over the past 4 years. And now, as you said, Matt, our incarceration rate is 10% higher than the rest of the entire United States. And in the United States, we have about 5% of the world's population, but we lock up 25% of the people in the entire world that are actually incarcerated. That's one reason. Another reason, I think, is because the admissions to our Tennessee Department of Correction, while they've actually declined 14% over the past years, but a major reason for the increase is that the people who are convicted are getting much longer average sentences. So when you take out the life sentences, the people who have been sentenced to life, and you take out the death row inmates, the average sentence has increased by 11%. It's gone from 58 months I mean, I'm sorry, it was increased by 11%. So in fiscal year 2018, it was actually 58 increase. So another reason is that it's in Tennessee, it's not been the violent offenses that have increased our incarceration rate, is that we are locking more people up for property crimes. So about 33% of our prisoners are there for nonviolent property crimes. And our violent crimes have only accounted for about just 1 in 4 people in our prisons are there because of violent crimes. And so we take a lot of our very, very expensive prison space and we use it for property crimes. Another reason is our violations of probation and violations of parole. And those account for about 39% of the prison admissions that we had in 2018. And many of them have been violated. I mean, some are violated for committing a new offense, and that's for sure. But there also have been many of them that have been, their probation or parole has been violated because they've because some violation to see their officer or not paying fines or cost of supervision or whatever it is. Then another reason is that in Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee, the felony rates of prison incarceration actually decreased from 2009 to 2018. But the admission rates from East Tennessee actually increased by 11%. So that made up for the difference in the decrease in Middle and West Tennessee. And then the last thing that I'll point out is the rate of female admissions to the Department of Correction. Those have actually increased 12% from 2009 to 2018. So we're locking up more women now than we had before 2009. So I think those are the reasons that I see of why our increase is so high.
Yeah, a lot of different things. Yeah, wow. So Attorney Simmons, what would you add to that?
Really what I would add to that is drugs. Drugs are are really one of the biggest reasons why a lot of people are getting incarcerated nowadays. I definitely agree that there's several issues with, probation violations, parole violations, people getting locked up for not paying fines and fees or doing community service or something like that. But drugs are a huge issue in Tennessee. I mean, East Tennessee, you're dealing with a whole lot of meth and opioids and things like that. In West Tennessee, we're dealing with those issues as well, but people are getting incarcerated for simple possession of marijuana. I'm not going to argue the fact of, should it be legal or anything like that, but people are being incarcerated for minor offenses. And so it's one of those things where you wonder, why are we paying all of this money to lock these people up on a shoplifting case? Jackson recently just stopped locking people up for shoplifting offenses because the jails were overflowing with people just for shoplifting. And so I think that the minor offenses that people are committing, unfortunately, the DA's office they're prosecuting them, and instead of just probation sentences and things like that, a lot of these people are getting jail time, which is kind of ridiculous. And as a defense attorney, I mean, we do our best to try to eliminate that, but unfortunately we can't. And then another issue is a lot of people have mental health issues. And there are a lot of people that are incarcerated that do not need to be incarcerated. Yes, they might have committed a crime, but there's an underlying issue. And so I feel like if we had more mental health courts and other types of courts that gave alternative sentencing rather than sending someone to prison just because of this crime, I think that it would drastically reduce the rate. And there are some judges across the state of Tennessee that have mental health court, drug courts, and things like that. But unfortunately, there's several that don't. And so we have a lot of people that are incarcerated due to drug addiction, homelessness, financial issues. And so people steal because they don't have anything. They don't have anything to feed their kids, so they go and steal. Or they have mental health issues and they're not on medication because they have the stigma of, oh, you're crazy, so let's not take the medicine, let's not go and see the doctors. And so it's a situation that they can't control on their own, and so they commit criminal offenses. And I've had several clients like that, and it's a really sad situation that we don't have a system that addresses these issues and instead locks them up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Deputy Chief Tisdale, as we mentioned in your introduction, you've been on the beat for a long time, 25 years. And so I imagine you've seen a lot of things change in that time frame. But, what would your opinion be on the incarceration rates in our state and even locally?
Yeah, I think Dr. Boyles and Attorney Simmons both were hitting the nail right on top of the head. I want to start with, first of all, talking about, probation and parole. People get, from the law enforcement perspective, there are laws on the book that we are held accountable for enforcing, whether it be crimes against persons, crimes against property, so on and so forth. We have to address them. We have to respond. And sometimes those crimes, no matter what, how simplistic or minor they may seem to us or the entire community, they're crimes nevertheless, and we are held to a standard of enforcing those crimes. So what happens is a lot of times you get taken in for a misdemeanor, say for marijuana, as Ms. Simmons, Kortney mentioned, and you, for whatever reason, you find yourself back out, and you got this parole or probation or whatever you're supposed to return. And a lot of times we find that people don't. And so what happens is, when we picking up people for failure to follow through with whatever their crime may have been, then we find ourselves, with higher populations of people for seemingly minor offenses. But the key word that I think that I may throw in that is that responsibility, accountability is that if the judge sets it, whether it's Kortney working with you or the judge sets that, we're accountable to follow through. Now, as far as Kortney mentioned something about drugs, there, West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and East Tennessee, Tennessee has a big issue when it comes to narcotics and drugs. I don't think anybody could argue that point. But when it comes to marijuana, the question about whether we should legalize it or not, that remains above where I'm at this point in time. My voice can be heard, but it's above where I should be at this point in time, because what's currently coming from the powers to be down to our level is that, hey, marijuana or any other drug of that caliber that's not prescribed by a doctor, what have you, is illegal. So we go through the process of locking people up. And so those little small things, it do increase our population. And the last thing that I leave on that is that we got to be careful, extremely careful, when we make incarcerating people, creating the facilities, there's income that is generated from that. So we got to be cautious about some of those things. And we got to begin to address those things. And so in order to address those things, I think while we have the conversations on the higher levels, we also got to have the conversations in the community about keeping people out of the system. Chief Weiser says it regularly. He said, it takes one incident and your child, your daughter, your son gets into the system, and the system is not really designed to let them out. So we got to be cautious about getting them in, having them to think about what decisions that they're making and in order to keep them out of the system, for whether it's a shoplifting crime, a misdemeanor amount of marijuana in their possession or whatever. So we got to be cautious about that.
Yeah. And so, I heard a number of things there. And I think one of the kind of consistent themes from all of you is that, number one, it's about the laws that we have. It's the laws of the land currently. And there can be debate about whether or not those laws are in and of themselves just. But Deputy Chief, to your point, the folks who serve under you, their responsibility is to make sure that the law is carried out. But Attorney Simmons, to your part, you're sitting there as a defense attorney at times trying to make sure that people are treated justly and are processed in the right way. And then, Dr. Boyles, you're trying to prepare the next group of folks who are going to go into the system and understand the best way to make sure that it's just. But, to kind of go back, to Attorney Simmons, you had kind of mentioned this a moment ago about this reality of kind of this buildup of cases and sheer number of cases that are being processed or that have to be processed. And so, the next question I want to ask is, how do the pretrial populations affect the numbers that we're talking about? And what does that say about our processing of cases and the burdens that places on our justice system?
Wow. The pretrial process, I will be honest, it's different from county to county, from court to court. Some people, you might get arrested, arraigned. I mean, it might be rapid fire, and then other cases you get arraigned, or counties you get arraigned, and it's a little while. You got some constitutional violations potentially coming into effect. But the thing is that pretrial incarceration is a problem, honestly and truly. There are some people that will sit in jail for a year or longer before their cases are resolved. And mainly the reason is because they can't make the bond, because the bond is so high. And so pretrial incarceration, the numbers would go drastically down if people could make reasonable bonds. And the purpose of the bond is to ensure that the person is going to come back to court. And it's also one to, they want to deter people from committing other crimes. But the main purpose is to make sure that they come back to court. They want to put enough skin in the game to make you come back to court. But unfortunately, you have people that are charged with offenses and you have a $300,000 bond. And it's like, you have no criminal history, but you have this outrageous bond. And most people know how bonds work. You make 10% using a bondsman, but most people can't come up with 10% of $300,000. Most people, the average person, really can't come up with 10% of $50,000. And so you run into a situation to where people have these extremely high bonds and they can't make them. So they sit in jail until the DA's office gets to their case. And the DA's office moves as quickly as they can. I mean, there's times where it's lab results and other things that cause pretrial delays, but the biggest issue is the bond, and people not being able to make them, and some of these bonds just being completely ridiculously high, and it just puts people that are already not extremely wealthy in a situation to where they can't make this bond. And if they do make the bond, now they have to hire an attorney, and guess what? They spent their attorney money on a bond, and so now the court won't give them an attorney. So what happens? That good bond that they spent all their money and put their house up to make gets revoked, and they get placed into custody. Why? So that they can get an appointed counsel. And so then what does that do? It drives the number up. So you got one out and you got three more back in.
Wow. Cindy, what would you add to that?
I looked up numbers because I really want to understand the pretrial situation in Tennessee. And in 2018 in Tennessee, local jails held about 15,400 pretrial detainees for both felony and misdemeanor charges. Wow. And so I think one of the things that we have to remember about pretrial detainees, they haven't been convicted of anything. I mean, supposedly, according to our law, they're innocent until proven guilty. So pretrial detainees throughout the state of Tennessee they average about 51% of our local jail population. And in 1990, it was about 30%. So it's gone up quite a bit since 1990. Now, of course, that means that some counties are higher, some are lower. And I don't know what it is in Madison County because that information isn't readily available anywhere. But there was an article in the Jackson Sun last year, and it was kind of difficult to do the math provided, but it appeared that the Madison County Jail held about 65% were the people there were pretrial detainees. And don't tell me to the bank on that number. It could be wrong. It's just, but it was a good percentage of people were. So one of the things that happens with pretrial detainees in Tennessee is that when we've got somebody who's being held on a pretrial charge or felony charge in Tennessee, the state does not reimburse the county for that expense of holding that person. So then that expense, of course, has to be absorbed by the county. So here in Madison County, anytime someone's charged with a felony and they're held in the jail before their trial, that impacts our local government's budget. And we know right now our local governments are hurting. I mean, they're having a hard time. And so when you affect the local government's budget, that also impacts the household's budget. So another thing that's happened in Tennessee, our pretrial detainee population, it increased in Tennessee faster than in all of the other states. So I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And then pretrial detention, it can have a negative impact on people that just ripples. And I think this is like what Kortney was talking about. It can cause people who were held in jail, it can cause them to lose their job. And if they lose their job, then they can lose their housing, they can lose their transportation. If they have children they're taking care of, where do their children go? If they're a single parent, their children may end up in the foster care system. And that's not a good thing, because if kids who are in the foster care system are more likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system. And when they're involved in the juvenile justice system, they're more likely to get involved in the adult criminal justice system. So it's just this, bad thing that doesn't work out for anybody. So the other part is, if a person can't afford bail, then in Tennessee, 100 days in jail. This is for felony charges, and it depends on the felony charge. So there was let me go back to another part, is that many people that are in jail waiting to go to trial are, they're looking at their life falling apart. And so they may be innocent people, but they may plead guilty just to get out of jail. And if they end up pleading guilty to a felony, that means there are a lot of collateral consequences that go along with that. That could be things like, the right to vote, the right to run or to hold public office, the right to hold certain jobs and professional certifications in some ways. In some cases, the right to get public assistance on things, the right to own a firearm. And those consequences can last a lifetime. It can be very expensive to try to get your right back to vote, or whatever it is that you're trying to get back. So there's just a lot of consequences of that. And another part is that people who are detained pre-trial, it results in likelihood of them actually being convicted. It increases their likelihood of being convicted, of being found guilty, or actually end up pleading guilty. Another part, and I'm sure Kortney knows about this, is that when people are detained, it makes it more difficult for them to help their attorney prepare for their defense, or help them to communicate with their attorney. About 97% of federal criminal convictions are done through a plea bargain. In the state convictions, about 94% of the convictions are through plea bargains. And so while we may have all these wonderful rights, we have, all of these constitutional rights that we have, when we plea bargain, we throw all that away. We say, nope, we're going to put all that aside. And so when people do go to trial, they can end up in what's called this is the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers calls this the trial penalty. So if you're off, they want to go to trial, they go to trial, it is very likely that you're going to get this penalty if you're found guilty, that you're going to receive a much harsher sentence than you would have received if you had taken the plea bargain. So there's an incentive there to do that. And there are a number of different kind of tactics that prosecutors can use to try to push people into plea bargaining. One thing is charge stacking. They just basically throw the book at you and charge you with everything they possibly can. Like Kortney said, the unaffordable bail. You can't afford it, you got to sit here. And you sit there long enough, finally it's like, man, I got to get out of here. I'll just go ahead and plead guilty to this. Prosecutors can also threaten to investigate or indict the person's family or their friends. And of course, then there's the trial penalty. So pretrial diversion, pretrial detainees, it's very costly in many ways. It costs us in the community, but it costs that person and it costs their family, and it can set their family up. Not even been found guilty of anything yet.
Yeah, wow. And so, you make mention of this, Cindy, that, part of the issue with, going ahead and taking that plea bargain is you essentially, particularly if you're pleading guilty to a felony, your citizenship, in a lot of ways is stripped. But yet you now have this felony charge. So if you ever have an issue in the future, that's going to come back to haunt you as well.
Exactly.
And so, you guys, spoke at length about the numbers and how we've seen such drastic increases in those numbers. Cindy, what you mentioned compared to 1990, we're sitting at 15,000 people in the state, over 15,000 people in the state who are currently pretrial detainees. But we've also seen that same type of increase, maybe even worse, when it comes to imprisonment. So in Tennessee, the rates of imprisonment have grown dramatically in the past 40 years, at 4 times what they were in 1978. And so the jail incarceration rate during that same period of time has doubled. Deputy Chief, let's start with you. What do you think has changed again so drastically over the past 40 years? And as I mentioned earlier, you've been doing this work for 25, almost 26 of those 40. So what's changed so drastically?
Matt, I think this is a really, really good question. It caused me to reflect back on myself. 40 years fits the core of my lifespan thus far. And I thought about what has changed since childhood to present day. And I thought about that right on the heels of the civil rights movement, some significant things began to take place. One was the opportunities that, some of the opportunities that became available, where you would see fathers going out the home to make the income in order to bring back home and take care of the family. We saw 2 families, a mother and a father, going out the doors in order to, this is my perspective, to bring in more income in order to obtain some of the things, what we call the American dream, that house, the car, whatever it may be, that part of the land. So what happened in that process? I think in that process, we saw our children where they potentially had a mother or somebody in the home, or as they say, an elder or grandmother or grandfather, somebody in the home. It was a little less representative, but there were still some. But nevertheless, we saw kids, I think they call them latchkey kids, so to speak, those kids that don't open this door for anybody unless it's me. And, I don't care who it is knocking on the door, don't open the door. But what were they entertained by? And at that point in time, it was new to the scene was television shows like MTV. So we had, rather than having mothers and fathers with core family values imparted in the children, I think we saw less of that, and we saw more of the world imparted into our children. And so the values began, I think we started to see a shift in values. And I myself am a prime example of that. I remember having, for instance, the sheriff call my home and say, "Hey, Mr. Tisdale, I saw your son in a place that he shouldn't be." I get home and my father's waiting on me. Why did I say that? Is because it wasn't just my mom and dad. It was about a community of people who knew who you were and were responsible for you and ensured that you were doing the right things. So in 40 years, I think we've seen a lot of shift in the core values in the family structure. What has been the ideal thing for families has now the pursuit of wealth, power, things, money, wealth has become the value of the day. And so when that does occur, I think there is a sacrifice, and what we end up sacrificing were the children and then the next generation out there. And so now I think if we look at where we are now, we see the results, the residue of that change about 40, maybe 50 years ago. So that is my perspective, is that, the opportunity has presented itself, and for everybody wanting to live that American dream, and for those that, found themselves a few years, several years behind, trying to play catch up. The only way we can catch up is work harder, and everybody put more skin in the game. And so that's just kind of my perspective on that particular question.
Yeah, I heard a community leader say a few years back that coming out of the civil rights movement, one of the things that the civil rights leaders kind of assumed is that the core family structure would remain intact. And as we transitioned out of the civil rights movement into the 70s and into the 80s, you did start to see more breakdowns of that core family structure. but I'm not, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which, you just spoken about very clearly there. Culture obviously is at a place to play in all of that. And that pursuit of keeping up with the Joneses, as you kind of make mention of. But, Cindy, what would you add to that?
Well, I think, things that Deputy Chief talked about on the personal level, I think and I'd like to kind of blow it up and look more on the kind of bigger societal. Some of the things that happened is that we saw a great increase in crime during the 1960s through the early 1990s. And then there had been an emphasis in our prisons in our penitentiaries on rehabilitation. But all of a sudden, there was a study, and I don't want to get into that, but it basically said nothing works. So we got into this nothing works doctrine that rehabilitation just doesn't work. And at the same time, under President Nixon, he started the war on drugs, and he declared that the drug abuse is our public enemy number one. And so it really, the whole war on drugs really ramped up, not only under him, but under other presidents also. And then incarceration rates for nonviolent drug laws really started increasing from 1980 to 1997. And we saw Congress pass very harsh penalties for drug offenses. States started doing that too. And that goes into what Kortney was talking about the number of people arrested for drugs. Well, by the late 1990s, violent crime was really thought to be out of control. And the homicide rate had started increasing by 5% every year starting in 1987. And it peaked in 1991. We had almost 10 deaths per 100,000 people in the population. And that was just considered to be out of control. We also saw increases in robberies and assaults. And then, of course, you throw in crack cocaine. And now, the crack cocaine epidemic. And it was just created this really scary world kind of scenario. Well, of course, then in 1994, we had the crime bill. And the crime bill, which got a lot of bipartisan support from Congress, and it had these things in it like 3 strikes, mandatory sentences for repeat offenders. It had money to hire 100,000 new police officers. It included $10 billion for funding prisons. It expanded the crimes that became death penalty eligible. So now more crimes you could reach to the death. Research that the crime bill didn't cause mass incarceration, but it accelerated what was already going on, was already occurring. And then it's also believed that the crime bill didn't lead to a decline in crime. So the crime peaked in 1991, started coming down in 92, but the crime bill came into effect in 94. So really the decrease in crime had started in 1992. And we've really been under this unprecedented decline in crime since 1992. There's been some ups and downs a little bit. For the most part, it's gone down. So in Tennessee, one of the things that has managed to grow our prison population overall has been that we've incarcerated more women, like I said before. And then Deputy Chief Tisdale mentioned earlier the privatization of prisons in Tennessee. So private prisons, the idea when they started was that private firms is I'm making money. And so they do that by doing things like paying staff less, not hiring as many staff, not training them as well, not giving them as good of benefits as the state would, short staffing shifts. And basically, they have contracts to fill their cells. And they even have lobbyists that go out and try to push for laws that will make laws to keep people in prison. So just, if I can add just a little personal thing here, is that I just don't believe that government should abdicate its authority of social control. And we give our government that authority to hold us accountable. And then when our government turns around and gives it to some place to make money off of it, I think that's an abdication of government's responsibility. I don't think that serves us or prisoners well by doing that. So I think part of the bottom line of this is that there is no politician who wants to be viewed as soft on crime. What politicians on both sides of the aisle have realized is that criminal justice costs us a lot of money, and incarcerating people. In Tennessee, we spend over $1 billion every year on incarcerating people. Over $1 billion in Tennessee. Think what we could do with that money if we weren't incarcerating so many people. But so today, what it's come down to is, if we follow the money and think about the money, Today, we talk about reforming criminal justice. And part of that reform is to trying to think smarter about what we're doing instead of just locking everybody up. So that incarceration is extremely costly. And there's better ways. And the thing is, we spend so much money, but it's not very effective if you look at our recidivism rates and what actually the collateral consequences of locking people up.
Yeah. And so, something, that you pointed out there was that, the crime bill in 94, maybe we could even say the war on drugs beginning in the 70s, didn't necessarily cause mass incarceration, but it accelerated. They certainly accelerated it. And you have that all taking place at the same time as, Deputy Chief, as you mentioned, as we see kind of pieces of the core family structure also breaking down. So that's all taking place together at the same time with all of these other pieces, the 3 strikes and you're out rules, the way that we changed, the plea bargain structure, all of that is taking place at the same time, contributing to this massive influx, the privatization of prisons, all of that. It's just stacking on top of one another, causing, what we see today. Kortney, let's transition a little bit. So we've been talking about the bigger problem. But at the same time, the conversation we're having tonight is called race and criminal justice. So let's kind of transition a little bit to talk about those intersections there. So people of color, we all know, according to the data, everyone can see it, that they are massively overrepresented in our prisons and in our jails. So this is true for Latinx individuals, 595 per 100,000. Are incarcerated. Native American population, 665 per 100,000. And this is compared to our white brothers and sisters of that population, 503 per 100,000. So again, 595, 665 versus 503. And so that's the case in a country, or rather in a state, talking a state that's 77.67% Caucasian. And then yet our African-American brothers and sisters, who make up just 16% of the population, are incarcerated at a rate 4 times that of whites. So, I said again that our white brothers and sisters are incarcerated 503 per 100,000. African-Americans are 1,962 per 100,000. Almost 4 times, again, the rate. So, as some have put forward, I've even had this conversation with people that I know. They talk about, the problem being with African-American populations. Are we suggesting that African-American or people of color are inherently more criminal? And if not, if that's not the situation, then what's going on here? Why are we seeing these vast discrepancies among the populations of color in our state? What would you say?
That's a lot. But no, the answer is no. The African-American community is not just inherently criminal. That's just an absurd thought. But if you look at the numbers, that's what it looks like. I mean, it looks like, oh, well, you look at a Black person like, he's probably going to commit a crime. And that's not the case. What's happening, what my thought is, and based on what I've seen over my years of practice, and then even in, law school, and just really kind of paying attention, is a lot of times minority communities are more heavily policed, and minority communities are more financially strapped. And in that, when you don't have money to feed your kids, you've got to figure out a way to feed your kids. I'm a mom. I have 2. And I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to feed mine. Just being honest. But I'm not going to go and commit a crime. But everyone wasn't raised the way that I was raised. Just like Deputy Chief Tisdale said about the family dynamic really kind of being broken down, you're kind of running into a generational curse situation to where my mom is, struggling. She's a single mom. It's just me and about 15 kids in the house. And so we don't have the family structure that we need to teach us what we really need to learn. And so we just go out and make money the best way we know how. So we go and hustle. And I don't knock the hustle. Do what you have to do. But make sure it's legal. Unfortunately, in minority communities, and I'm not just going to say Black communities, I'm going to say minority communities, that's what happens. The young children end up seeing, oh, I can get easy money by just going out here on this corner and selling up, selling a rock or two, selling a dime back here or there. And so they get used to that quick money. And now they can help mom. Now they can put food on their table. Now they're the man of the house because dad isn't there. That's a problem. So mom had started having kids probably young. So it's a kid raising a kid, and then it just keeps going down and down and down. And unfortunately, the Black community, I'm just gonna go there on that one. The Black community has been held down for so long that they couldn't find a way to excel. There was always, and I hate to use the phrase, but there's always been a knee on our neck. Everybody doesn't have the same opportunities as everyone else. You can say it all day, but that's not the case. And so what happens is you have a group of minorities who have got this little area, and it's typically the projects. And what happens? These kids and these generational curses are turning around and they see, oh, well, my daddy was in jail because he was selling drugs, so I should sell drugs. And every once in a while, you get those few that are like, I don't want to do this. And so then they're able to break free. But unfortunately, it's perpetuated because they get public assistance. I don't knock public assistance, but public assistance sometimes encourages people to just stay home instead of getting out and working. And if you know better, you do better. That's just kind of how I was raised and what I think. And so we're not, minorities or the Black community specifically are not inherently criminal. If you think about it, there's actually probably more white criminals than there are minority criminals, and they're just not getting caught because things are swept under the rug. Mommy and daddy have money to just kind of hush things away. In my own career, I've seen that happen. I know money talks sometimes. To me, it doesn't. I treat all my clients the same. You can pay me a $10,000 retainer and I'll be appointed to represent you in court. I'm going to treat you the same. I don't care about that. I care about representing people for what they, on the merits of their case. But that's what it is. We have communities of minorities that are just kind of stuck in a rut. And unfortunately, they've been held down for so long that a lot of people just are not pushing their way out of it. And is it an excuse? No. I think that if you know better, you should do better. But unfortunately, some of these people don't have the opportunity and opportunities presented to them in order to do better, in order to stop selling drugs, in order to stop committing crimes. And then there you have it. And I keep going on drugs, but I mean, there's stupid stuff like fighting in the street, like getting stuff, shoplifting, domestic violence, all of that. And so there's a lot of things, but it's not race. We're not inherently criminal. It's just, unfortunately, we're in situations to where we're more policed and people look at us with a little more scrutiny than other races. And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. And, there's a lot in there. I think a big part of kind of what you're talking about there is socioeconomic, and the implications of all of that and how poverty plays out. For those of you watching, we're going to do a whole section on that next week. It's going to all be on socioeconomics. And I think that is the challenging piece in all of this, is that so much of this overlaps, and that's really, a lot of your responses to these last 2 or 3 questions. That's kind of what we've seen. There's a lot of layers to all of this.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Real quick on to what Kortney brought to the table about being heavily policed. And it does seem like that, but here's, one of the things that I've noticed in my career, and even more so now, is that right on the heels of all the incidents that has created this conversation that we're having now across the country, is that we're still getting phone calls at the Jackson Police Department about presence, not heavily presence, the fact that I trying to minimize a presence in the community. And where's the police? We're not seeing the police over here. We want a special patrol. It is coming from leaders of communities, citizens that live in that community, what have you. So when you are getting that call, or they're saying that this or that person is creating issues or chaos in the community, yeah, you do see a heavy police presence. And I'm speaking particularly to what's here in Jackson, Tennessee. Now, one of the things that I will add in there is that what Chief Weiser and I have attempted to do is that we've made an effort and to reach across the aisle to pastors. What we notice, say, and it just uses, for instance, in the area around Lincoln Courts, there are roughly, you could probably throw a rock and hit maybe 6 churches. And what we're trying to do is minimize our footprint in the community, because we know that a lot of times when the police presence in the community, it has a tendency to go south, or not the direction you want it to be. So if we can reach across the aisle and say, hey, Pastor, we're having some issues in the community, not that we want you to go out there and solve them, but what does God place in your heart? Is it to open your doors and have a class to educate the young mother, as Kortney say, on how to care for family, and maybe in the absence of a father, or teach this young man how to go out and to be a father, to be a young man, to be a critical piece to the, what's going on in his family, to what's going on in the community. And then, and I'm a strong advocate for not only the church being a part of that plan, but I'm also a strong advocate for the community taking part in being the change that they want to see. In fact, somebody told me this last week, and I wrote it down. It says, do the work our souls must have. And when I think about that, that says a whole lot. Our souls are crying out for this change, but we got to do the work. And what does that look like? And it just really requires that first step. So, and also we got to quit glorifying that lifestyle that Kortney's saying, you get out here, you're trying to do the hustle, you sell a rock or whatever, trying to help mom. I understand it, but there are consequences that could cost you in the long run. But anytime we look at television, look at a magazine, or in the school systems, when I go to elementary schools, I hear these kids, and it's almost like they glorify that lifestyle, that to run from the police, to live this lifestyle, to live on the edge is where it's at. And so we've got to do more. And it's an issue that I won't be able to fix, but it's the 5 of us could probably begin to make that happen. So yeah, she brought some good pointers up, and I just wanted to reach out, just comment on that quickly.
Yeah. And I think, to be perfectly honest, both of kind of what you guys are touching on is the need for this to be, the solutions come from the community. It's going to take the whole community to provide these solutions. That's one of the whole reasons that we are even, having these conversations, and that we want to continue. And to be honest and transparent, ultimately these conversations aren't the solution, right? Like these conversations are not going to be what solves these problems. Mm-hmm. It's a starting point, but there's so much more work to be done. And Deputy Chief, even as you mentioned, for churches, I'm an associate pastor somewhere. I know you in seminary. It's going to take other people to get involved and make these their issues, make these their concerns. Be their brother's keeper, be their sister's keeper. We all owe it to our kids to be able to do that. And so, yeah, that's a huge part of it. Both of you kind of mentioned, the moment that we're in right now. Deputy Chief, you kind of recall, what started all of this was this kind of idea of over policing. And Attorney Simmons, you have brought that up, and you guys are in agreement. There over policing is to a degree a real thing. But there are some reasons why that takes place. With that being the case, the current movement that we are in right now, we know that originated based on what many people in this country viewed as a massive injustice perpetrated by a police officer. And so many, there are several of our white brothers and sisters have kind of asked this question of why that particular moment triggered such a strong reaction among, not only people of color, but also other white folks. And so the question that we have to ask, and kind of dig into tonight is, was this an isolated incident, or is it, really one snapshot of a much bigger problem in our country in reference to policing? So Cindy, why don't you jump in first on that? What would you say?
So I hope that this is going to be a sustained effort to reform criminal justice. I've worked in criminal justice for, since 1985 in one way or another. And I have just seen the injustices in the system. And I think that this is a really good opportunity for us to try to disparities that we have not only in the criminal justice system, but it's also in a lot of other institutions. And this is really just my opinion. I kind of think that this pandemic has forced all of us to be at home. Not all of us, but many of us. It's forced us to be home, and we've kind of had to slow down and just to kind of reach out to the world, like what's going on out there. We had to be aware of what's going on in this country instead of just being focused on our own little universe. As I think that video of George Floyd's death, for me, was powerful and it was haunting. Really just to see the callousness of those officers, and then to hear the bystanders pleading with them to let him up, to check his pulse when they could tell he wasn't moving anymore. And then when you can hear him calling out for his mother. And when I watched that, I didn't realize that his mother was dead. I didn't realize. I heard his mother had died. It's just heartbreaking. And at the same time, we were getting news of Breonna Taylor's death. She's in her own home at night, asleep. Ahmaud Arbery being killed when he just went out for a run in a neighborhood. This was overwhelming, and the deaths just seemed to keep coming at that time. There were other people who were killed at the same time too, other African Americans who were killed. And for me, I feel rather powerless against the pandemic. I can't stop it. But I don't want to feel that way towards these deaths that have occurred. And I think for me, these deaths have just compelled me to action. And I think it's compelled other white people to say, whoa, wait a minute. This is what's going on. I've got to actually see this. And so whether, we're taking to the streets and protest, or whether we're attending forums like this, or we're contacting our elected representatives, or we're about issues that are facing our Black and brown neighbors, whatever form it takes, I just think we're compelled to do something. And so I hope that this is going to be a sustained effort that will bring some real change to our various criminal justice and other systems also.
Yeah. Deputy Chief, what would you say?
Just like Dr. Boyles said, that particular incident, it was right in your face, and I think that is what anybody with a heart could see, that it was something definitely wrong with how that incident went down. From my perspective, in my years in the law enforcement community, no, this is not what we would consider a much bigger problem even from my personal experience at the Jackson Police Department. What I will put it like this: I think any officer that's working the street, they have to know what's expected of them, and that you will hold them accountable for the behavior. I've constantly told, preached, taught, it comes from leadership across the board, is that these are the guidelines that guide our behavior, and any violations of those guidelines, you will be held accountable. I think if historically, and I think it's no secret, Chief fired an officer because of that very reason. Even upon appeal to the Civil Service Board, that they upheld the chief's decision. It takes leadership such as that to be able to say, hey, if I'm an officer and I'm doing this right here, that I may not have some support in the background. What made that particular officer have that type of behavior, and not even give the thought that I might be, if I don't do something different, that there was going to be some repercussions, and to have the other officers surrounding him not to say, hey, hey, you need to get up, move, do this, do that. There's something maybe with that particular agency, I think somebody may need to take a look at. But from my perspective here at the Jackson Police Department, whether just something body using inappropriate conversation or addressing somebody in the community, we're just not going to tolerate it, and it will be addressed accordingly. So I think that first of all has to be on the table um, at law enforcement communities across the country and say, hey, um, we're not going to tolerate this behavior. If you do, this is not a place for you. And I know we don't have the time in this space to talk about this, but one of the things I talk about that, we're all environments, products of our environment, right? And some of us, but we can't use that as an excuse. What helped shape us and helped formed us, formed our ideas. We can't allow that. We can't use that as an excuse for how we behave in society. We got to, some of us came up in societies where one race may have hated the other race, but that's not an excuse for how you carry out your duties here. And it's hard to vet that thought process or what shaped and formed the person when they come into a particular agency, but actions will speak loud. And you got to be able to document actions especially when they brought to your attention. You got to be able to sit down and have that conversation. You got to be able to have that training to say, hey, look at this V Academy. This is here's a class on ethics. Look at it, read it, understand it. Here's a general order. Send it down, take a look at it. Emphasizes to the police officers, this is what guides us. And that violations of this, you can't say that you didn't know and didn't understand. But accountability is a big part of that. And it starts at the top all the way down. And I think once people see that you're serious, then you have officers themselves holding other officers accountable for their actions out on the street.
Yeah, I think that, there's a number of really important points you made in there. And I know that your primary role and task is to speak, about your experience with JPD. And, I think that we can be really honest on this call and say, Attorney Simmons and I had this conversation several weeks ago, that, overall, we're really blessed in Jackson, Tennessee to have the type of police department that we have. We recognize that by and large, we have a very fair and just police department that has good leadership, like folks like you. So we have that privilege. And I know, again, that's your primary perspective and experience. You spent your career with JPD, and you've arisen, you've rose through the ranks. We have a good chief. But to your point about the importance of leadership, of having the right leadership and leading from the top, would you say that it's also fair for us to ask the question, if a lot of police departments in America have the same type of quality leadership that you guys have? You talked about the accountability, the expectation that police officers conduct themselves in a professional way, that they follow the code of ethics and all those pieces. What if you don't have that type of leadership coming from the top? What if you don't have that type of accountability? And I think that to Cindy's point earlier, that seems to be the concern for a lot of people across the country and in our community. Is there's also that history, again, thankfully not in Jackson, but in other places, of, as Kortney mentioned, not just particular families of wealth sweeping things under the rug, but even that same type of thing happening in police departments and in justice systems. So what do we do with that? What do we do as a community? Again, our specific community may not be handling that with JPD, but how do we process that?
I think that if you look across the board from the east to the west coast, there are a lot of different law enforcement agencies have governing bodies that help law enforcement officers in, and they go out and they perform a duty, and maybe they violated a law or whatever, that can create lifelong life within that agency that could be detrimental to the name of the agency and to the profession of law enforcement. And so we got to, I think for those who have the ability to do that, is to be able to have those conversations and see those, like, say for instance, unions is what I'm referring to. What do those unions do? Do they, are they, I know they helping the officer out, maybe the officers maybe not, being accountable for whatever their behavior may have been versus what somebody else may have had to experience. But we got to look at still, what does that say to the community, especially if you want to build trust within that community. And so Jackson, we don't have those. We have a union, a governing body of a union that helps us, and I think that it does make a difference by not having one, and by having leadership from the top down that holds everybody under them accountable from the bottom up and from under them down. But what does that say about those particular agencies, like the one that had to deal with George Floyd? I'm not there, but it does cause me to ask the question again of myself with the other officers there. Why didn't anybody feel concern or fear? Because usually if there's the potential that there's a repercussion or something will come on the heels or whatever, it invokes a different response, a different behavior. If that makes sense.
Yeah. You're essentially saying if we do something wrong on the job, every normal person expects for there to be some type of repercussion, right?
Yeah. And so what was in play there that I could do what I did and have the disposition that I had, and not worry about what you were trying to say, and not be concerned about you filming me either. That's concerning for me, because that cannot happen here in Jackson. And right now we got officers outfitted with the BWC body-worn cameras, and our captains daily, they take especially if we have a complaint of some kind that comes in, if we have a use of force, they look at that body cam footage to make sure that the use of force is in alignment with our department policies and procedures. And if there's an issue, then is it a training issue that we need to go back and revisit, or is it a officer issue? If it's an officer issue, we may start with just something as simple as a counseling, or talk to that officer, say, hey, look, what's going on, what's going through your head? Okay, well, we need to send you back to retraining, and we're going to document it. Okay, so if it comes up again, what do? We go back and look at it and say, well, on this day, July, whatever today is, 30th, you were supervisor sit with you, counseled you, sent you back to retraining on this, but here it is again. So it continues up the ante on what what that officer discipline that officer will receive. But I don't want to speculate on what's going on in that particular community, but it does, even for me, cause me to wonder and think about, could I have been in the same way? Because obviously there was no fear. And in this place right here, all I have is my name at the Jackson Police Department, and I have a family, and I'm not willing to jeopardize that for the next officer that's for there. So I'm going to try to do what's right, because I want to jeopardize you and your profession and your job, and I hope to do the same with you. If not, we're going to have a conversation.
And you brought up something, you said a word that I think is so very important that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's counseling. Mm-hmm. Really thinking about what our police officers have to go through, the things that they see, the things that they experience, and whether we're, as a community, if we're thinking about that aspect as well, that, that's a heavy burden to have to carry. And I know that, we've had that conversation probably, that, JPD has those type of services available, and that's something that you guys consider and you care a lot about. I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's part of the conversation that we sometimes miss. It's crazy. We've been going for a little over an hour now. Time has gone by really quickly. And so, we're going to have to wrap this up. And it's getting good. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask, can we do this again? Maybe in a few weeks we can do this again. But before we wrap up, I do want to ask one more question. We had about 4 or 5 more questions to try to get through, but I want to end on a positive note. And so, The question I want to ask is, what are the current programs that you guys know about that are kind of out in the community that are going on that, Cindy, you had mentioned much earlier. One of the core problems with a lot of this is that somewhere along the line, we stop viewing, incarceration and criminal justice itself as a way to do rehabilitation. We stopped viewing rehabilitation as really even the goal, because somewhere along the line, we kind of felt like it wasn't working. It didn't work. But we know that that's not 100% true, right? There are some good things that are going on, some good programs, even here in our own community, designed specifically for the betterment of those who've been convicted. So what are some of those programs that you guys know about? Cindy, let's start with you, and then Kortney, and then we'll finish with you, Deputy Chief.
Okay. I would love to tell you that we have a wonderful pretrial release program, but I can't do that because if we have one, I don't know anything about it and I haven't found anything about it. I wish we did. I think that would be wonderful for our community and for people to get caught up in this system. But there is a program that I know about that is for kids here, at-risk children, students in our community, and it's operated by Juanita Jones, and it's Keep My Hood Good. And I teach a juvenile justice class, and actually Juanita was one of my students years ago, and we've been able to hook up my students with her students and do some things every year with them, and it really benefits my students, and I think her students get something out of it too. But I'm just always really impressed by the things that she is doing with her students and giving them opportunities and encouraging them, and I think we need more programs. Court system, Leslie Tosh has a comfort dog and has been using Navi as a tool for counseling with kids and when they're going to court, when they're nervous, and helping with that. And so I think there's some really good things happening in this community. I think there's some other things that we need to do. I think our criminal justice players should get together and make things like a pretrial release program. I don't know if we have a pretrial diversion program. Maybe Kortney knows. If we have one, that's wonderful. But if we don't, we should. So there are some things that we could do here to reduce those people that are in jail, pretrial detainees, and other programs that we can do to help. We either have a school to prison pipeline, which is kind of like what we have now, or we can create a school to university, vocational training, technical job. It's really our choice what we choose to do. And I think part of that is electing, electing local people to carry out those kinds of programs for us and to have those kind of priorities with the budgeting that we have.
Yeah. Attorney Simmons.
Well, there are actually several programs. I will say, as far as a pretrial diversion program, there's not like a set pretrial diversion program. I wish there was. There's judicial diversion. It's typically what you end up doing, and I won't go into all the details of that on a case-by-case basis, but it's not like a set program. But there are drug courts. City court has a drug court. I do believe all of the circuit courts have drug courts. City court actually has a mental health court. And so I think that those are super beneficial because it allows for people to come out of jail and go into a program that's really dealing with their underlying issues. In juvenile court, she did bring up Navi, but there's also programs for juveniles. There's I can't think of the name of it, but juvenile court has set up a program with the University of Memphis Lambeth campus, where the juveniles, they might get in trouble, but they go over there. They're getting fed, they're getting tutored, and they're getting experiences that they would never experience. And so, Judge Little has done a really good job working with her team to get that set up. And I really think that it's going to start at the kids. If it doesn't start at the children, adults can be saved, yes, but I really think that if you start when they're young, that will just ingrain positivity in their lives, and they're not going to do it and get in trouble as much. But those are a few of the programs that are available right now that I think that are really addressing the underlying issues that the people are facing and that are causing them to commit the crimes.
Yeah, yeah. Deputy Chief?
You allow me to go last, and I have even less about programs that are available than Kortney and Dr. Boyles. But I would do what I did have listed was keep my hood good, and I agree. Ms. Juanita is doing an excellent job, and investing into our youth and the next generation is coming along. But I also want to throw out a group that I'm participating with myself and people like Ryan Porter. It's called Boys to Men. And Kortney is right. There are a bunch of great people, programs out here for adults, but I am trying to prevent the next generations from getting caught up. So we're having those conversations in the elementary school level, trying to build some relationships and trying to just share with young men, that guess what? Derick Tisdale didn't grow up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He grew up in a little country town and had to work hard, but there were some things that I had to do. And so Boys to Men is being that program for us. Is right now it's small. We can use some more men such as yourself, Matt, to participate. But again, we're in the elementary school, and we're just having conversations with young men that are, let's just say the teachers may not want to just sit still. They're a little, itchy, want to move around. So we have those conversations. They talk about what men do, what it means to be a man. And so I know it has to be working, because out in the community, I've had little kids come up to me, young boys come up to me, and it's like, you remember me? And I was like, yeah. And then you Boys to Men, and they shake my hand the way we taught them how you shake a man's hand, or you shake a woman's hand, how you be respectful or whatever, because a lot of times they don't get that.
Yeah. And, so, I know it was hard to kind of come up with some examples. And I think that in and of itself is the indicator that, we got a lot of work to do. I would throw out there that there are other programs, the Day Reporting Center that's doing a lot of good work over there with rehabilitation. The Focused Deterrence Program was a brand new thing in the city, helping those who have some violent crime offenses, kind of hopefully turn their lives around. Of course, some of the programs you guys already mentioned, some of the work, the ACEs work that's going on in our community at various different levels, also connected with juvenile court. So there, DCS, the work DCS and DHS have been doing. There's a lot of different things. It's hard sometimes. We forget some of them, but at the same time, as I mentioned, and as you kind of guys all exemplified, there's still a lot of work we can do. And so I want to thank every single one of you for being on tonight again. I want to do this again. I want to come back because we got some more stuff to talk about. So hopefully we could do this again very soon. I want to thank everybody that watched. Again, thank you to our sponsors, United Way of West Tennessee, the Jackson Chamber, and also our Jackson Home. We'll continue these conversations. We have our last movie showing as part of the Be the Change series this Saturday night at 8:15. That'll be at Union University's Great Lawn, where we'll be watching Just Mercy, which is very much about these very same issues. And so please come out, and we'll be social distancing, but we'll have plenty of space to do it, have a great big old screen. Come out and take part in that last film screening. We'll be back again next week at the same time, 6 o'clock next Thursday. Next week, we'll be talking about race and socioeconomics, some things that we kind of touched on a little bit tonight. And so, again, I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Lord willing, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.